Yeah, sure. So a lot of settings required Madhavan to do all this. I never realized. Yeah, Madhavan, you may unmute yourself. Yeah, fine, I think. And you would like to load your presentation, Madhavan, now? Yeah.
Is it visible?
Yeah, it's perfectly visible.
Okay.
Thank you. So let me start. Good afternoon to all of you, dear friends. A warm welcome from Sanjay Verma. I'm professor at IIM Ahmedabad, and along with me we have Deepak and Mansi, who are helping us to bring this presentation and talk live to you. The topic of today's talk is making Parliament more effective, and we have Mr. M.R. Madhavan as today's speaker. Also, let me share with you that this is 20th talk of this series. With your blessings, the series has really picked up very well, and we have talks of different nature, which has been enjoyed by many people, and they have learned a lot. To come to the topic and talk of the day, you know, we are experts at everything. I was talking to Madhavan, and if India launches a missile, everyone becomes expert on missiles. Then we are experts at COVID. We are experts on foreign policy. We are experts on constitution, and so on and so forth. So, question is, how much do we know about our constitution, our parliament, and how the government functions? Let's know more about this, and let's know more about this from someone who works with very close quarters with our politicians, our parliamentarians, and yet maintains a distance of more than 6 meters from politics. Let me introduce you M.R. Madhavan. Madhavan work is focused on strengthening the core institutions at the center of Indian democracy, parliament and state legislatures. PRS provides research inputs to MPs and MLAs on bills, budgets, and policies discussed in legislatures, and makes legislative information accessible to the general citizens. Before starting PRS in 2005, Madhavan spent almost a decade at ICICI Securities and Bank of America, writing research on equities, interest rates, and currency markets. He holds a BTech from IIT Madras and PGDM and FPM from IIM Calcutta. He has been recognized as a distinguished alumnus by IIT Madras and IIM Calcutta, and was awarded the Social Entrepreneur of the Year 2019 by Business Standard. I'm also very happy to share with you that I studied at IIM Calcutta, and it was my good luck that I studied at the time when Madhavan was there with me. We joined in the same batch, I think, Madhavan, in our PhD program. On personal front, Madhavan is a very fun-loving, humorous person, and he's also an encyclopedia of knowledge as well as people. He knew, if I remember correctly, 6 batches of IIM Calcutta, at least to my knowledge, and I don't know how many people he knew about, and he knew everyone in every batch. That's what Madhavan is. Madhavan, thanks to you for giving your acceptance to come to IIM Ahmedabad in a virtual manner and sharing with us what you do and what are the interesting ways in which government functions. Maybe many things we don't know at all. So therefore, please enlighten us, and all yours now, Madhavan. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Sanjay. First, thank you for inviting me for this. I mean, it's a pleasure to be at this event by IIM Ahmedabad. I have actually been to the campus several times. It's a lovely place and always good fun interacting with people at IMA. Before I start my presentation, I'll probably spend about a minute explaining what I do, and why this presentation ties in with that. So we set up PRS in 2005, and the whole idea was simple, and you will see as I go into the presentation a bunch of those things, that Parliament is at the center of our democracy. And if we want our democracy to function well, it will do that only if Parliament does. And as an institution, Parliament has had its challenges, and I'll be talking about that. And what we do at PRS is to help strengthen its work. And the way we do it is actually in 2 very different ways, which complement each other. One is working with MPs and helping them with research on all bills, various policies that are discussed, when the budget comes, that, etc. And we do not take a position, we do not give recommendations, we just do the analysis, and we work with MPs across all parties. The second thing we do is provide information about Parliament out into the public domain, because it's important that as citizens, we know what our representatives are doing, and we hold them accountable. I'll be talking more about that in my presentation. So this is primarily what we do. And we have also started working with MLAs at the state level over the last few years. We do a bunch of related things. Coming to what I wanted to talk today is, again, what exactly, why do we need Parliament to be more effective? And how do we do that? So first, what is the role of Parliament? What does Parliament do? So at the heart of it, Parliament is a deliberative body. It looks at issues, people from different, who are elected from different constituencies and may have different perspectives, different ways of looking at things and different interests. They discuss these issues, and then they reach some sort of a consensus and a conclusion, and sometimes not a consensus, but a majority vote. And that moves the ball forward. It is also the absolute key institution that holds the executive to account for its actions. So Parliament does this. And before I go into what Parliament does, I thought it'd be interesting to take a quick look at the profile of our current parliamentarians. And I am focusing primarily on Lok Sabha, though Rajya Sabha has an equal say on many things, because Lok Sabha is the directly elected body, 543 members. It used to have 2 more nominated Anglo-Indians, but no more after the last constitution amendment. So its strength is 543, directly elected, and I'm sure many of you have gone, most of you would have voted. So who are these people? So interesting thing that we have put out, and if you look at this graph and just focus at the bottom part, the blue line, blue bar. So this is the first parliament which was elected in 1952 to the current one, the 17th Lok Sabha, which was elected last year. And if you look at the blue bar, which tells you the percentage of MPs who are below 40 years of age. 25 is the minimum age anyway. So 25 to 40. And you can see that the number has been, the proportion actually has been trending downwards, a bit up and down. And if you look at the yellow thing right on top, that proportion is people who are 71 or more, and it has been going up. So actually Parliament has been getting older is the trend line, though India has been getting younger. There has been a lot of talk about education levels of parliamentarians. It's interesting to see that they are actually well educated. About 80% of them, 75% plus of them have at least a college degree. And if you look at the profile, they are usually from fairly good places. And actually the percentage has been increasing. So if you look again, the blue bar at the bottom, which means people do not have a college degree, that's so educated up to 12, that blue has been in general on a declining trend, though the last couple of Lok Sabha. The interesting thing is we have a very high churn rate in our Lok Sabha. So I have looked at data right up to 1984 elections. Almost all Lok Sabhas, about 50% or more. This time was like 49%. Or this time out of the 543, 272 is 50% mark, 267 were first time MPs. So you can see the 265, sorry, were first time MPs. So you can see that the number of MPs with significant amount of experience is not very high. Women, the percentage has been slowly trending up, but still very poor. I mean, it should be, population percentage should be 14%. Even the women's reservation bill had asked for 33%. We have moved up to 14. This is the best we have had, but the best is still way below what should be a fair representation. This I found very interesting. I managed to get hold of the first Lok Sabha, the professions that these are all self-declared data. So the MPs, they declare their professions. So the first Lok Sabha is the green one, and the latest Lok Sabha is the blue one. And if you look at the bottom bar, the last bar at the bottom, you will see that first Lok Sabha, nobody really said they were political and social service. And this was a Lok Sabha full of the freedom fighters. So most of them had another profession. My guess is somebody like Nehru would have said, I'm a lawyer. And the lawyer bar, as you can see, is very high in the first Lok Sabha. Whereas now, we have much more of people whose primary profession is politics and social service. Okay, so this is what our parliament currently looks like. Now coming back to what I started with, what exactly is the role of parliament? So as I said, it's a deliberative body. It's one of its most important roles is to hold the executive to account, check the executive's work at all times. So if you actually think of the constitution as a document which puts in a bunch of checks and balances, which is what it does, there are three main branches of government: the executive, the judiciary, and the legislative. So the executive does all the actions. The government does all the actions. Now the government's actions, since government has a lot of power, because if you think of it, the executive controls violence. The executive has the police. The executive has the army. They are controlled by the executive. So they have a monopoly on violence in some sense. So how do you make sure that the executive does not move towards an autocracy or a dictatorship? You put in checks and balances. So there are different ways of checks and balances. Of course, there is the federal versus union checks and balance where you're splitting up the jobs. But within each, the horizontal checks and balances, the judiciary checks the legality of all actions of this executive. So judiciary's job is to check whether whatever the executive is done is legal, it conforms to the laws, it conforms to the constitution. The legislature does something slightly different. It checks whether what the executive is doing is appropriate, whether this is the right approach among different alternatives. What should be the most wise approach? So the legislature is checking about whether the executive is working in the appropriate manner. So it could be legal, but may not be appropriate, in which case the legislature checks, is not the judiciary. That's the design. Of course, in our country, the judiciary has extended its reach, in my opinion, far more than what it ought to be. But that's a different story. That's a different presentation when we talk about the judiciary. And what is Parliament supposed to do? At least in theory, there are different ways of looking at it. One of my favorite speeches is, and I would recommend that you just Google, download this and read it. It's all of 3 pages if you print it out. It's a very famous speech by Burke in 1774. He made this speech just after he got elected at Bristol, and the speech was to his constituents, and where he actually said that Parliament is a deliberative assembly of one nation with one interest, that of the whole, where not local purposes, not local prejudices, but you're looking at the general good and the general reason of the whole. That's what we're trying to do. Oh, just a second. Yeah. So what's Burke saying? It's saying that Parliament works and parliamentarians work, though they are elected from individual constituencies, they are expected to work in national interest. So whether you are elected from Kerala, whether you are elected from Mizoram, if there are floods happening, let's say in Himachal or Uttarakhand, I mean, it is your duty to also think about it, because that's part of national interest. So you are actually looking that, and Parliament, a very important role it does is it helps resolve tension across various issues. I mean, just if I go back to various, historically, if you think back, right in the first decade of our republic, there was a lot of tension regarding states, where Andhra Pradesh started the demand of a separate state based on language, and Parliament over a period of time figured out how to resolve this, and the state reorganizations happened first with Andhra, but the big one in 1956 with the Constitution Amendment, and that was a way to manage tensions. And you can see various different tensions being resolved by Parliament, by parliamentarians. Even if you think what is right now on the table in front of Parliament, there are a set of labor laws. What are labor laws? There is an interest there are multiple interests, very obvious ones. There is an interest of the employer, and there's the interest of the employee. How do you manage to resolve and find a middle way which is acceptable to a large number of people? Parliament has also done a lot of social reform in our history. I mean, various ones. Just to take one example, anti-dowry legislation was a major social reform in those days, and it has done a bunch of them. Now, there has been discussion I have seen in public domain on parliamentary system versus presidential system. And for me, the best way to think about it is possibly what B.R. Ambedkar said while introducing the draft constitution in the Constituent Assembly. He discussed it, and he discussed why the proposal in the draft constitution was for a parliamentary form. And his argument was that there is a tension between stability and accountability. A presidential form provides much higher level of stability. For example, we have seen President Trump, the only way you can remove President Trump is by impeachment, which is a very difficult process, which they tried, and he was Though he was impeached by the House, the Senate did not move him out. So it's a much, much more stable. Whereas in a parliamentary system, the government uh, is being tested every single day. So through questions, through motions, and at the final, as the nuclear button is the no confidence motion, and any prime minister at any point of time, if a majority of members of Lok Sabha lose confidence in the prime minister has to go, and we have seen that happen several times in our country. And Ambedkar's argument was that in a country like India, accountability is possibly more important than stability. We need an accountable government and therefore a parliamentary system. The reason I've gone into it in great detail is I'm going to now discuss how parliament has functioned, how well it has done, and what we need to do better. But before how well it has done, how does parliament work? Okay, and what does parliament do? This is standard stuff. Most of you would know it. 4 major functions. It makes laws. It holds the government to account, as I said. It sanctions the expenditure of the government. So the government cannot spend any money unless the budget is passed and the demands for each ministry are passed. And of course, while doing all this, it represents the interests of the people. And our parliament has yet another function. It can amend the constitution. And of course, the power to amend the constitution is not unlimited after the 1973 Keshwanath Bharati judgment, but within those limits, it can amend the constitution. So this is what parliament does. How does it do it? It works as a plenary, so the entire house sits, or the house sits in committees. What does it do when it does in plenary? So this is a typical day of Lok Sabha. Rajya Sabha is similar, except that 0 hour and question hour are flipped. It starts. So Lok Sabha starts with question hour. This is when MPs can ask questions to ministers, and questions are of course given in advance, but follow-up questions or supplementary questions the minister doesn't know them. So the minister has to answer, and this is how you hold the ministers and through the ministers the government accountable to parliament and through parliament to the people of India. The whole idea is that the government should be accountable to people of India, and that is done through parliament. 12 to 1, any issue of urgent importance, something which has cropped up, something where you want to raise the issue and bring it to the attention of the government and to the wider parliament, that's what MPs do. That's called 0 hour. Then after the lunch break is what's called government business, in which time you do the bills are passed, budgets are passed, larger issues are discussed. If there is an issue, for example, I'm sure when parliament meets again, whenever it does, there will be some discussion on the health issues, some discussion on migrants, some discussion on COVID. All that will be scheduled between 2 and 6. So this is what happens in the house. This is what is telecast. This is what you can watch. But a lot of work happens outside the house in committees. So there are different types of committees. The 3 financial committees, which are the public account, public undertakings estimate, public account and public undertaking, look at the CAG reports, and they in a sense are like the, if I think of it as a corporate board setup, we are the shareholders as people of India. Parliament is the board, and these committees are like the audit committee of a board. So they will be looking at the auditor's report, which is the CAG, and examining and asking questions. Then there are the very important, my second bullet, recommendatory, departmentally related standing committees. These committees look at bills which have been proposed. They examine the budgets of every department. Then they look at issues. There are 24 of these committees. They have 21 members from Lok Sabha and 10 from Rajya Sabha. And they are organized, each of the 24 is organized on departmental lines. So there will be a committee on finance, which looks at finance, corporate affairs. There is a different committee on external affairs. There's a committee on home, like that. I mean, so there are 24 such committees. The importance of these committees cannot be overstated. Though they are recommendatory, the recommendations are taken in fairly serious tone and the government actually responds to them. Now let's see how well Parliament has been doing. Now comes sort of the sad story. And look at the green line, which is Lok Sabha, and you can see that this is the annual number of days that Parliament has. So in the 50s and 60s, Parliament used to work more than 20 days. The dips that you see these years, these are election years, so there is some time taken off during the elections, so there is a dip. But otherwise, the trend line has stayed over 120 days right up to early 70s, or even during the emergency. And then it started coming down, and now Parliament barely meets for something like 75 to 80 days. And we rarely see 80, we usually see about 70 days a year. So the number of days that Parliament has met has started coming down sharply. What makes it even worse is this is the days, but there are lots of disruptions during the days they meet, so they lose even the scheduled time. So this is the dotted line is 100. So anything above is if they have met more than scheduled time, below is where they have met less than scheduled time. And as you can see, especially this was during the UPA 2 period, lots of disruptions. Parliament actually met for just 2/3 of its scheduled time in that parliament, in the 15th Lok Sabha, which is the period of UPA 2 in the government. The result of that is if you're meeting for less number of days, even those days you're not meeting for the scheduled time, your total number of hours that you're meeting has drastically come down. It is now in the range of something like 1700, less than 2000 hours per parliament, but it used to be more than 3,500. So Parliament works for much lesser time now. The result is that a lot of bills get passed without much discussion. 15th Lok Sabha, which is a UPA 2 period, you can see that less than 1 hour, 17 plus 9 is less than 30 minutes, which means practically no discussion. So more than a quarter of bills, almost absolutely no discussion, another 10% barely any discussion. The number improved a lot in the last Lok Sabha. This Lok Sabha, I haven't put the number because it's just 1 year down. The last Lok Sabha, the number improved a lot. But on the other hand, bills being sent to committees and committees examining bills has dropped sharply in the 16th. So this is, the blue line is the number of bills that were introduced, and the orange line is the number of bills which were, orange bar is the number of bills which were referred to committees. So you can see that barely a quarter of all bills were referred to committees in the last Lok Sabha, which was close to 75% in the previous. So they are introducing much lesser number of bills. Amount of time discussing the budget has also started coming. Last year was not too bad, but in general, the number has been. So Parliament's work has started declining over a period of time. What should we do about it? Can we do something, and what are the core causes why it has started coming down? I think that, and this is an opinion built over working with Parliament for 15 years and thinking about this and talking to people about this, is that for me, India had a functional parliament up to 1985, when Parliament was sort of made a redundant body and a rubber stamp of the executive by the 52nd Amendment of the Constitution, which brought in something which is popularly known as the anti-defection law. So what does the anti-defection law do? It says that on any issue where there is a vote, it could be a no confidence motion, or it could be a bill, or it could be any other debate which is followed by a motion. For example, IIM Ahmedabad is now a statutorily recognized institution because a couple of years ago, the IIM Act was passed. So there may be different MPs having different points of opinion on different provisions of the bill. But on any clause when there is a vote, if their party has issued a whip, the MP better go with the whip. If the party says, say, support this provision, the MP has to support the provision. And if the MP doesn't do so, he or she will be disqualified from parliament. They will lose their seat in parliament. So this is what the anti-defection law does. So effectively what it has done is, it has changed parliament from a place where MPs have different points of view, which they still have, but then they argue the different points of view, try to convince each other and find a resolution. Instead of that, whatever happens, happens off the screen, happens between parties behind the scenes. But when they come into parliament, they can only posture because they can only vote as per the party's dictate. So this is what the anti-defection law does. So what does it, so as I said, it applies to all votes, not just confidence motion. Idea when it was brought in was that governments are falling because members are being given various incentives to vote against, ruling party members are giving incentives to vote against the party, move to the other side, governments become unstable, so we need stability. That was the idea. But it applies to all votes. It even applies to Rajya Sabha, which has no say in the formation of a government. And it has ended up making MPs purely the voice of the party. And when we vote, we actually vote not just for the party, we vote for the MP. And the MP is supposed to represent the views of the constituency as well as the national interest as the MP thinks as per the constitution. That goes off. And the irony is, where it was intended to work, it doesn't work. I mean, we have seen very recently Karnataka, what happened, Madhya Pradesh, what happened, even now what has been happening in Manipur, and what has been supposedly happening in your own state with the Rajya Sabha election in Gujarat, what is going on in Rajasthan. So the anti-defection law doesn't work because there can be an incentive well enough to do. The only way to resolve the anti-defection law is actually to make sure that political parties reform themselves. They stand for an ideology. They get in good people who are with that ideology, and therefore they move with the ideology. This is how good democracies function. We have lost that, and with that we have weakened parliament. So for me, the very important reform is we should get rid of this. We should just get rid of the anti-defection law, repeal 10 schedule. There will be some amount of defections in the beginning, which is anyway happening. Maybe the price of the MP will come down. That's all will happen. And it will stabilize into a more functioning parliament. Interesting thing, I looked at this hard and I've tried to find data from all over the world. And I have found that there is no mature democracy which has anything of this type. There are exactly 5 other countries which have something similar to our anti-defection law. 2 of them are our neighbors, Pakistan and Bangladesh. The others are Sierra Leone, Zimbabwe, and Guinea. And these are not, I think, democracies we should try to emulate. The second big one is that most of the votes, what happens by voice vote. So the speaker says, those in support say A, those against say no. So the guys and the speaker hears the A's, hears the no's. Whoever has said more, according to the speaker, from whatever the speaker can hear, is what goes through. If any MP demands, then there is a division, which you would have seen when you have watched some of the bigger debates. Occasionally it happens when they get onto the recorded voting and they press the button, and then you see those red, green, and yellows coming up. But most votes are not. And this graph shows you that the percentage of votes of bills which are passed with recorded votes is very, very small. So hardly any bill, less than 10% of bills are passed with recorded votes. So we need why is this important? When we have seen, I'm sure many of you have seen the debates in the United States, which will again happen soon. And they talk about voting records of people. So I'm sure when Joe Biden comes up, because he was a senator at one time, People will pull up his voting record and ask him about why he voted in a particular way. We do not have any record of our MPs. So, as a resident of New Delhi, I have a right to know which way my MP voted. I don't have that information because nobody has that information, because that information is not collected. So the accountability of the MP to the people who have elected has been lost in two ways. One is there is no vote for, there is no record of the way the MP voted. Second, the MP can anyway say, well, the party told me to vote this way. I know that you would have wanted me to vote different way. Even I agree with you, but I had no choice because I would have been thrown out of parliament, not just the party. So I had no choice. So that's what had happened. So we have actually lost the linkage between the member of parliament being a true representative of the people who elected the MP. Instead, the MP is just a voice of the party. The third important thing that I wanted to talk about is that there is a wide range of subjects which come in front of MPs. So just now, for example, in Parliament, there are bills which are, let's say that there is a labor, there are 4 bills or 3 of them now, which are redrawing the entire labor laws. So you have to understand how that works. There is a different bill which is looking at how DNA will be used for criminal investigation. There is a bill which is looking at surrogacy. Sorry, there is yet another bill which is, I'm just giving you the sort of range of topics that can come. There will be some bills looking at water. There will be bills at education. There will be bills at healthcare. How can anyone understand the nuances of all these issues? So what developed countries have done is they have created research support for MPs so that MPs can take a decision. It's almost like saying that you're the CEO of a company, but you do not have an office. You have to work on your own. No CEO can do that. So I have put up the numbers, and you can just see that the US and the UK have really resourced their MPs very well, but we have almost none. CRS is the Congressional Research Service, and CBO is the Congressional Budget Office, both of which support all the senators and the representatives in the House. Plus, each senator gets somewhere between $3 and $5 million to hire staff every year. We give 40,000 per month, and you can imagine what you can get for that. Some more before I stop. A couple of more issues. We need to reduce disruptions. How can we do that? One is, I would say, simply increase number of sitting days. So even if you have disruption, you still have many more days, and you can therefore still discuss issues. And secondly, the disruptions happen because opposition wants to raise an issue. The government doesn't let them raise that issue. And therefore they say, unless this issue is discussed, we are not going to let your agenda go forward. And they discuss. If you have more days, you can do both. The UK has something called opposition time. So 1 day a week is reserved for the opposition to raise issues. And that's divided 17 days for the, so it's 20 days a year, 17 days for the primary party, 3 among the next other opposition parties. Then various other ways, for example, a no confidence motion can be raised according to our rules if 50 MPs demand it. So which means about 10% of the strength demands it. Then the motion will be taken up. Of course, the motion to pass will require 50%, but it will be taken up. Can we do something like that to say that if 10% of MPs, 15% of MPs, 20% of MPs sign a notice, that has to be taken up even if the majority does not want it? Because remember, the majority is always by definition the government, and the government can also issue a whip, and even without that, parties have a lot of hold, so they can block anything that's embarrassing to the government from being discussed. So can we have something like that? And of course, action against disruption. Similarly, Parliament is convened when the president summons Parliament. The Constitution says president shall summon at a time and place. Okay, Constitution also says that the president shall act on the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. So effectively, it is the Prime Minister who decides when Parliament meets. And Parliament can be difficult for any government at any point of time, because Parliament checks the action of the government. So government can reduce the meetings, can delay meetings. So can we actually do something like an annual calendar when it will be, it's decided beforehand. So it's not issue by issue. It's not when there is an embarrassing event, the parliament schedule is postponed. Of course, you have to have a session at least once in 6 months, that the constitution says. But can you do it more often? And secondly, can there be a significant minority? Let's say something like 25%, 30%, one third, some bar like that. If that number of MPs ask for a session has to be held. Can we make some rule like that? So these are some of the ideas. A very important one, we have something called an ordinance, and it's very important to note that the power of the executive to make law when legislature is not sitting, which is the ordinance, it's as good as a law. It is in force till 6 weeks after the beginning of the next sitting. But such power exists only in 3 countries, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, because this power came from 1935 Government of India Act and from 1919 Government of India Act, where the Brits said essentially that we are letting you form a central legislature, but if the Viceroy wants to make, if the Governor General wants to make law, the Governor General can. So I don't know why we incorporated it, but it's there in our constitution. I think this should go. No democracy has it other than India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. What do they do if there is an urgent requirement for a law? They call an urgent sitting of the legislature. The idea is that the separation of power, only legislature can legislate, executive cannot. So we should possibly do that. The bar chart shows, so it was, though it was supposed to be only for very urgent reasons, you can see the number of ordinances here. And since the last session of parliament, which ended on 23rd March, I think we have already passed 13 of them in the last 3 months. So it's been raining ordinances. Committees, as I said, there is less being referred to them. We should make it mandatory. In the UK, every bill has to go to committee. We should have something like that, and also provide them research staff. Finally, what happens now? How Parliament met and adjourned its session slightly early. So it was supposed to meet till 3rd of April. 23rd March was the last day when they decided to adjourn, just ahead of the lockdown because of COVID, but they should meet. Parliaments around the world are meeting. They are using different ways. Why can't we use those? The reason I am saying this is, the country is going through serious crisis. And I can see at least 3 crisis events going on right now. One is, of course, the healthcare crisis because of the virus. How do we manage that? How do we treat people? How do we minimize death? A second related one is the lockdown and various of the measures that were taken, and because of virus itself, we have landed up in an economic crisis. Almost everybody expects GDP growth to be negative. So this year's GDP will be less than last year's. We haven't seen that in my lifetime, so in any significant way. So it's a serious crisis. And the third crisis, of course, is what's happening at the border now with China. And when these things are going on, it's very important that these are discussed by our representatives, by our national representatives in parliament, and a way found forward. We can't leave these decisions to be left to the executive, to a few joint secretaries and secretaries. None of them were elected. We didn't elect them. It's our elected representatives who must finally check and challenge the work of the executive at all times, and we should do that. How can we do that? Different countries are doing different things. Committees can definitely do video conferencing. There are 30 members. Figure out a way to do secure video conferencing. Can we use more technology? Can we do physical distancing? Can we do hybrid? UK went on a hybrid mode for some time. Interestingly, in today's newspaper, there is an article, there is a news item which says that Rajya Sabha has been discussing and will possibly do a hybrid mode where they sit, about half the members sit in the house, and the other half are in either galleries or in another hall with TV screens and mics fixed there, or maybe some even through video conferencing from their homes. But my contention is, if we claim that we are the world's largest democracy, which we keep claiming at all forums, and we also claim that we are the IT service provider to the world, which we are in various ways, can't we marry these two strengths and get Parliament to actually function? Can we use IT to get Parliament to function? So that's the question, and I think it's imperative that Parliament meets as soon as possible. Final thoughts. If we look back 1952 to now, nearly 70 years, of Parliament has actually done a pretty good job of negotiating various interests in India. India has had, the level of diversity on various lines, ethnic lines, language lines, religious lines that India has on various other parameters, no other country has. And we all know how identity plays out. We all know how identity has split various countries. Even the other country which was formed at the time of partition, Pakistan, split on an identity issue of language. But we have managed to stay together. And I would say that I can actually point out various things that we have done from time to time, amending the constitution, making relevant laws to diffuse the tension that builds up in society. It has also done a bunch of reform on society and on the economy. But as I pointed out, that we need to improve its effectiveness, and there are structural issues that we need to do. And the reason I'm saying, and I think all this, is that unless Parliament is robust, what is at risk is our liberties. Parliament holds our liberties, safeguards our liberties. And if we want India to move towards its aspirations as mentioned in the preamble to the Constitution, we need Parliament to work. And as citizens of India, it's also incumbent on us to hold Parliament and parliamentarians accountable towards performing their duty. So we should ask them, what did you do in Parliament? And we should also enable them to do this. So with this, I will stop here, and I am happy to take questions.
Thanks a lot, Madhavan. So let me just bring some questions that are being asked in the process. Let me start with a question from Rohit Bodhe. He's asking, what are the basic criteria for amendment of any bill or act? If modifications required to do in any bill or act, how PRS India helps to Indian government? It's about your organization also.
Okay. Firstly, we do not work with the government. Okay, government is the executive. So PRS has no work with the executive. PRS looks at its role as strengthening the work of the legislature, which is in tension with the executive because it oversees the work of the executive. Okay, that's the first part. Now, how are these amended? Okay, acts are amended through amendment bills. Technically, any MP can bring a bill, but in practice, only a government bill gets passed in India. The last private member bill which became law was in 1970. For all practical purposes, we can assume that no private member bill, which is a bill brought by an MP who is not in the government, will get passed, is zero. So only government bills will get passed. So what do we do? So when a bill is introduced, the bill is discussed in Parliament. It goes to the committee, and it comes back for the second reading. At that time, any MP can propose amendments to the bill. And those amendments are discussed, debated, and voted upon. Usually only the government's amendments get passed, but I have seen a couple of instances where another member's amendment the government has accepted and taken it forward. A lot of work happens in committees. So committees recommend changes. Very often the government accepts the committee's recommendations. A classic example is, let's say, the Insolvency Bankruptcy Code. That was referred to a committee, the joint committee of the two houses. That committee examined called in a lot of witnesses. PRS was one of the groups that was invited. So we had also gone and made a presentation to them, explaining the issues of the bill. and pointing out some of the problems with the bill. So many others had done. That committee came out with a report and its own formulation of the bill with the changes. That bill was taken up and passed. So in a way, what was passed was quite different from what was originally proposed by the government. So the way PRS helps is PRS helps MP understand the issues and nuances of the bill. What are the implications of the different provisions? What are the different alternatives? Of course, we leave it to them to decide what would be a more appropriate alternative, because that is a political call. That's an ideology call, which we will not take.
Madhavan, there is a question from Amol Agarwal. He says, has Indian constitution served us well? How do we compare with respect to other constitutions?
Interesting question. So, the average life of a constitution is 15 years, 1-5. Okay. Ours has lasted 7-0. Okay. That itself is credible. We have, of course, made 104 amendments, but they are made as per the procedure in the constitution. I am a big fan of the Indian constitution. It has done something that most constitutions, like the American constitution, which of course, was the constitution for its day, to be done in the 1780s, to think through it, and as a pioneer, it is an amazing piece of work. And it has lasted, again, more than almost 250 years. So that's an amazing piece. But still, what our constitution does is it puts in a social reform agenda. For example, even if you look at fundamental rights, there are equality provisions, but there is also this provision of untouchability being banned. It's in the fundamental rights. There is the provision that there will be no titles. That is why for example, many of us are cricket fans. You know Sir Viv Richards, but there is no Sir Sunil Gavaskar. There is no Sir Sachin Tendulkar, because titles cannot be accepted. It would be unconstitutional. Okay. So it does that. It has done it pretty well. And most importantly, if you look at what most political scientists were talking about India, India was very interesting to them because we were one of the first to get independent from colonial powers, and we had formed this interesting constitution, and we are a very diverse country. The story was that India will not survive. India will break up because India is not a nation. A nation was seen as one language, one religion, one ethnicity. That is the European version of a nation. Italy is for people who speak Italian. Germanic people live in Germany. People who speak Spanish live in Spain. They are either Catholics or Protestants. You're never Catholic and Protestants in a country. But we as of now have 22 languages recognized in the Constitution. God knows, people have said there are actually 700 languages we have. God knows how many. If you look at the number of religions where there are at least 1 million people following, we have a very large number. Even if you take a crore, that's a very large number. And our Constitution has managed to do this and managed to stay as a democracy throughout, except for a minor blip in 1976-77. That I think is a major achievement.
Madhavan, Amol Deshmukh on Facebook is asking, he says, as per Ambedkar, the constitution needed to be reviewed and alteration should be made after 15 years. Now, I don't know whether it's factually correct or not, but who is responsible for making this change?
Ambedkar didn't say that. Okay, this is something that comes from, I think, Jefferson or Madison, I think Jefferson, where he said every generation must make its own constitution and it should not. Essentially, what right does a generation have to decide how the next generation will live or will form itself? That is the thought behind it. He quoted that, but he said that it's very important to have something that lasts long. And therefore, this argument was made to make the constitution flexible enough to be amended. And we have amended it 104 times. So though we do have the same constitution, remember it has been amended and amended significantly. For example, I would say a very important amendment, which was not popular in those days because it went back on some promises, but I think is important, was removal of privy purses and titles. And the reason I think it's important is that if we think that we are a country where every citizen is equal, you cannot have a class of citizens who are Maharajas and a class of citizens who are commoners. A Maharaja equals commoners has to be there in the constitution, which is what that amendment did, which was done in the 1970s. So we have done a bunch of these.
Madhavan, there is a question from Pramod who says, the attendance of our MPs in parliament is very low. What should be done to ensure that they attend seriously and regularly?
Is there a way I can take a poll? I don't think so.
We had to create it earlier.
No, don't create. I'll do a simple one. I'll do a very simple one. Okay. I'll just ask a question, and on the screen, at least people who are here on Zoom can, is the attendance over 60%? I'm giving three choices: 60 to 100, 30 to 60, 0 to 30. Okay. 60% use the Zoom tool for raising hands. 60 to 100.
Okay. On Facebook also, maybe they can say yes, something like this. So
maybe they can say. I can't see that.
Yeah. So I will maybe.
Okay. 30 to 60. Less than 30. Okay, I'll give the answer. The attendance as per the records, and we keep that closely, is somewhere about 78 to 80%. That's the average attendance in parliament, which is very high. When you see the screen, when you see TV, you won't find that. You will find roughly about 50% of the seats empty, usually. The reason is that they are coming in and out. They are coming for some time of the day. But I have been to the US Congress, and I have been to the UK Parliament. UK Parliament, if you see, usually, I mean, I'm not talking about this year because COVID times are special times, distancing and all, let's say last year or something like that. The usual attendance would be about 20-25%. US was hilarious. I had gone to see the Senate discussion. There are exactly one person in the chair, one person speaking, and one more person sitting. And the person speaking was actually looking all around the room as if there are people. And the TV screen camera focused only on that person. So no one knows how many people are there. But I was in the gallery, so I could see that. So our attendance is pretty good in that sense. The more important question is, what do they do? Do they have a voice? Can they express their opinion? Can they vote as per what they think? What is the incentive for them to do research and form an opinion if they have to finally vote as per what the party tells them to vote? Those are the larger questions which I would focus on than to say, do they attend? Because even if they attend and then they have to just press the button as per the party's direction, why do they need to attend? You can just say that party leader says yes and all the votes of the party go there. It's equal, it's mathematically equivalent.
Okay, Madhavan, there is question from, actually similar question from 2-3 people. So it's about anti-defection law, and as you have said that law maybe should be repealed. So people are saying, won't it make horse trading easy? People can be purchased at a price and so on and so forth. And it will again go back to the square one. So they have some difference of opinion with you.
My count, are we at square zero? We are already at square one. So the last time Parliament had any serious no confidence motion, if you remember, was in 2008 when the left parties pulled out of UPA 1. That was the last time there was a serious confidence. We have had one last Parliament, but that was irrelevant, right? I mean, the government had a huge majority. What happened that time? 21 MPs voted against party whip. Okay. What have we seen in all the states in the last 1 year? Look at any state. Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Gujarat, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh recently. I mean, where have people not defected? Northeast states. Okay. Sikkim was amazing, right? A party gets one seat or two seats and that party forms the government. Same thing happened in one of the Northeast states. The party with two seats formed the government because they managed to buy out everything else. So the anti-defection law, as it stands today, does not work to stop defections. So let us get that clear. It is useless as far as defections go. Okay. What it does is, for issues which are less impact on the government than the government falling, but which are important to the country. Lots of discussions. I mean, would you not want a good discussion and a proper vote on, let us say, the IIM bill which was passed? Why should that be hostage to one person? So today, given that the BJP on its own has a majority, if the Prime Minister decides this bill has to pass and issues a whip, that bill will pass. There is no question of that not passing. So why do we need Parliament? We can just say the executive will pass the bill. Parliament meets once, elects the Prime Minister, and then we meet after 5 years like the Chinese 3,000 member parliament, which meets, I think, once in 3 years for 5 days or something like that. Why don't we do that?
So there is a question. Sorry.
And no other country, no other democracy has it, and they work better than us.
Sanjay Garg wants to know who is the best parliamentarian in history of Indian politics, according to your viewpoint.
I don't rate them. I'm not in that business.
Okay. Now, there is a question related to the MP led scheme, where they get, I think now it's suspended, but they used to get 5 crore rupees. Maybe started with 1 crore and then 5 crore.
Started with 50 lakh.
Yeah. So it's about, it's supposed to develop things as per district plan, and money should come through DC, but it has been in center of controversy. So this is question from Lieutenant Colonel L.C. Verma.
I have argued, I have written about this in an article in the Hindu about a couple of months back, when they removed it, they suspended that it should be removed forever. I have argued elsewhere that MP led Supreme Court in not striking it down as unconstitutional. Okay, I think MP led should not exist. I'll tell you why. The job of the executive is to execute projects. It is they who should decide the projects, who should do that. The job of the legislator is to oversee the work of the executive, to allocate funds and see that the executive is doing its job. If the legislator starts doing the job of the executive, who will oversee that? I cannot oversee my own because there is a direct conflict of interest over that. That's one. So it goes against the idea of separation of powers, where the legislature is overseeing the executive. And on a different point, the union budget is 30 lakh crore. MP lads that an MP gets is 5 crore. The MP is expected, as per the constitution, to decide how the union budget is to be allocated. So think of yourself, one pocket you have 30 lakh, another pocket you have 5 rupees, one pocket you have 30 lakh rupees. Which one should you be focusing your attention on? Unnecessarily the attention comes to this 5 rupees and you are not looking at the 30 lakh. So for me, this 5 crore is an irrelevant amount of money. It looks large, but given 30 lakh crore is what we spend, it's irrelevant. So it should not even exist. It just distracts.
Madhavan, we all talk about the party which is in power. What about the behavior of the party in opposition, whosoever it may be? And there's a question, similar questions from Sanjay Garg also.
You're primarily talking about disruptions, is it?
Yeah, possibly. And I'm referring to that.
Yeah. So this is interesting. India is this, I mean, Western democracies don't see this sort of disruption. various Asians do. Unfortunately, we have seen that. Uh, every party, regardless of whether it's in the treasury benches or in the opposition benches, ought to follow parliamentary processes. According to me, no one should ever walk into the well of the house. You have a right to walk out and protest. If you want to protest, you say, okay, I don't agree, I walk out and do a symbolic walkout, which is what used to happen in our parliament for the first 20 years, after which it started deteriorating. And there are various reasons for it also. And one of the reasons, so there is an article if you Google, you should be able to find it. In 2012, Mr. Arun Jaitley, who was then the leader of opposition in Rajya Sabha, wrote an article, op-ed in the Hindu, that argued that disruptions are a valid parliamentary process. Of course, he was in the opposition then. Okay. And his argument was that if the government does not allow discussions on a topic which embarrasses it, we have no option but to stop all work until that is done. And this was in the wake of the disruptions after allegations of poll scam. This was in August 2012. You should be able to find that article. Okay. Now, taking article at face value, the solution would be increase number of days, make sure that opposition has a larger voice. So how are topics decided now? It is by consensus by a business, by a committee of parliament, which is called the BSC. And that committee obviously has membership as per the strength. And because in Lok Sabha, government always is in the majority by definition, government can decide that something will not be discussed. Can we get rid of this? Can we give opposition some time so that they can decide that topic? And then say, okay, you want to discuss in that time, but don't disrupt other business. Similarly, if a significant minority of MPs want a discussion, that should be scheduled. So you can make changes in procedures which strengthens and enables opposition, and the price for that would be opposition should decide.
Should there be some kind of exam? That's what is question from Abhishek for parliamentarians.
We have exams for bureaucrats and we know how well they function. Pakistan has a graduate degree requirement for parliamentarians, and at least we can say that our democracy is better than Pakistan's democracy. And we started at the same point in 1947. I mean, I think this is one of those things that middle class people keep bringing up, which I think is, I mean, if voters think that somebody is not qualified enough to be elected, voters need not vote for that person. Democracy means voters decide. You don't put in extra qualification other than some very basic thing that, I mean, you don't want somebody who's convicted of criminal offenses there, or somebody who's too young, so you put some basic age for judgment issues. Beyond that, you let the voters decide. That's what democracy is all about.
Madhavan, education is still not accessible in a large part of our country. These people, they may not be maybe that well educated, but they are very intelligent. Means I have
they are well
so many
educated.
leaders.
80% of them have a graduate degree. Okay, 10% of them have PhDs. 10%.
Yeah. And even if people don't have, they are very, very intelligent. Maybe we we may think that, you know, they may bring a certain kind of profile out for public consumption, but each one of them has been very intelligent. That's what I think I have experienced. There is a question, is there any way where, you know, for our common men in our country to talk to the legislation or maybe to communicate what it wants related to infrastructure or maybe other public sector issues, because for 5 years there is no communication whatsoever. Krishna Chandru Pandey wants to know this.
Yes, yes. In fact, Parliament has become much more accessible and open in the last, whatever, couple of decades. So there are various things. One is there's something called a petition which you can take up to your MP, and then the MP can put up the petition to something called a petitions committee and it gets in. you can meet and raise issues. MP can raise issues in parliament. If there is a bill which is coming up in parliament, in a committee of parliament, they usually put out a public advertisement saying that this committee is going to look at this bill. If anybody has views, you can write in to us. And if you write in and you indicate your willingness to appear, they may even call you. It depends upon what you write and how they perceive you. I have personally been invited to depose about 20 times over the last few years across various committees. And it's an amazing experience because they listen to you, they ask you the right questions, they try to understand the issue. And in committees, they are not taking political positions. They are trying to understand and figure out the issues. So there are many channels. One, your own MP, and two, the larger parliament to which you can write, which allow you to get in your inputs into the system.
Madhavan, I have one observation. Many times, general public gets very much disturbed when they see parliaments fighting with each other within the premise, but outside they are very friendly. So what I tell people is that, you know, they are opponents, they're not enemies. What do you think? Should that be the line, or should these people fight outside also as they fight or argue within the parliament?
So next time there is an India Australia match, would you want Virat Kohli and Steve Smith to be fighting in the bar after the day's play, or would you like them to sit together and have a beer together? You are political adversaries. You are not personal enemies. Okay. And we do events, we do sessions of MPs every Wednesday when we discuss an issue. In fact, we have been doing it now alternate Wednesdays over Zoom. In fact, we started with one of your professors, Chinmay Tumbe, speaking on migration. We had them, and we had MPs across parties on a Zoom call. And I mean, they are trying to understand. As going back to my Burke statement, MPs are there trying to find, they're all working for one nation. They're all trying to figure out what is in national interest. They may have different ideologies, they may have different points of views of looking at things, and therefore their own version of what's national interest may be different. But one has to respect that all of them or many of them are actually working towards what they think is national interest. And they need to discuss with each other and figure out that.
Madhavan, Manush wants to, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. He says that for purposes like defense or foreign policy, shouldn't we have a minister with a specific degree in that subject? Is it hard to find a handful of people who have a specific degree in defense or economics taking that ministry from a population of 130 crore? Many Nordic countries have such a provision.
So if you look at so parliamentary committees, typically people go according to interest and abilities. So that's how committees are formed and parties put them there. But parliament represents the people. Parliament is supposed to take our interests and think of it. And the idea is experts need to be consulted. The government should have experts both inside and outside and consulting. And parliament's job is to oversee how the final impact is coming through. Where you need some support and expertise. That is why you need research staff, etc. But beyond that, you will have generalists simply because almost every parliamentarian is expert in something or the other, but everybody can't be an expert on everything.
Madhavan, the last question. Of late, we have seen that a lot of role of parliament has been taken over by judiciary also. For example, when judiciary passes a judgment, it becomes a law in a way. And parliamentarians also, find it challenging to question judiciary, which may be right possibly. So what are your views on this, abdiction or maybe giving up the responsibility to judiciary?
I have fairly on this. I think our judiciary has overreached into both the executive's area and parliament's area on many things, and the result has not done its core role also in many other things. Okay, I'll just give you one very mundane example. About 5 years ago, the Supreme Court passed a law saying that, or rather an order saying that, any truck coming into Delhi, because Delhi had a lot of pollution, any truck coming into Delhi will pay an extra tax of some amount of money. Now, the constitution is explicit that taxation shall be made only by law. And this goes back to 14th century English parliament, which said that the king cannot impose tax unless parliament allows the king to impose a tax. It has that long a history. So judiciary can impose a fine as per law. Judiciary can interpret law, but judiciary should not be making law. And even something like, I think the judgment, Visakha judgment, which people say is a great judgment, I don't think so. Because when judiciary makes law and you like that law and you think it is good, wait, you have opened the door for them to make a law that you don't like. So for me, process is more important than outcome, because process is what protects us from bad outcomes. Because if you allow process to be shortchanged for a good outcome because you like it, the process will be shortchanged next time because you have precedent for shortchanging to reach a bad outcome. So I agree with you. Judiciary, I think, has overreached on many, many different judgments.
Thanks a lot, Madhavan. Thanks a lot for coming. I have one interesting observation. Out of the three pillars, let's say judiciary, maybe, and parliamentarians and bureaucracy, you know, once a person joins a job, it's rare that he or she is evaluated for the life which he has in public service, the person. Judiciary also, you know, it's very difficult to remove someone, but it's parliament and legislation that get questioned every 5 years. So they are the most evaluated pillars of democracy, if you see. And we may be unhappy, but we have at least we have right to throw them out. We don't have right on anyone else, at least the two other pillars. So that way, if we see, you know, they are the most checked people in our society. Thanks a lot, Madhavan, for such a brilliant presentation. I was about to say, and Satyam Sarvankar wrote that, so, you know, very insightful. And your thoughts actually make me happy, that and gives me confidence that we are, you know, in a right set of environment. Of course, not everything is as per our expectations. Maybe we may improve. Certainly, there are a lot of things, a lot of room for improvement. But if we see history, our parliament has come up with very interesting and very good rules, even whatsoever, whoever were the people in parliament. You know, if you see maybe Manrega or right to information, whatsoever, good acts have been passed, and it's helping us to develop the country. Thanks a lot, Madhavan, once again, and I hope we'll see you sometime later once again to share maybe another piece of thought with us. Thanks from all of us for being here. Thanks to audience also for being a nice audience, asking interesting questions. Thanks to all people who are there on Facebook also. Thanks a lot, Madhavan. Thank you.
Sanjay, thanks. Thanks for it.
Thank you.